Hey, Cameron here with Wattage Tech, and today I have something special for you. It's been a minute since I put out a video, but it's because I've been collecting a lot of data, mostly out of my own morbid curiosity on these things. And what I've been working on is it's not comprehensive yet, but it's a good stab at a comprehensive view of mobile CPU efficiency. Now, a lot of times when people look at CPU efficiency, they're looking at it from more of a stock or specific configuration of laptop perspective when they look at their efficiency numbers. So I'm doing it a little bit differently. And I'm going to be showing you basically a lot of different figures on a lot of different mobile CPUs, and we'll go through all of those in just a second here, but I just want to tell you how I'm doing this so you understand what we're doing in the first place. Basically what I did is I took a couple tools that are available to use, throttle stop and Ryzen ADJ, and I set both the long and short power limits to a very specific watt level, starting at 8 watts all the way up to 45 watts. And what I did is I actually capped the package power for both short and long at a certain level and ran Geekbench in both single and multi score sets. And I wanted to see, how much power I got per performance on different generations of CPUs, whether that be AMD, whether that be Intel, whether that be this new Snapdragon X Elite. I really wanted to look and see, at what level of power how do these things compare to each other, especially intergenerationally. Now, I will preface this that I am using what the CPU itself reports as its package power, whether on the Intel end or the AMD end. So comparing between vendors, AMD CPUs versus AMD CPUs. I think that's probably going to be pretty accurate, and when you're comparing Intel versus Intel, probably pretty accurate. When you're comparing AMD and Intel, it may shift slightly left or right when we look at these efficiency curves, but based on what I was seeing from total system power consumption, because that's something I could measure also from the wall. Every time I did this, I had a power meter on the notebook that I was working on to see how much power it was pulling from the wall. And what I saw is while it's not like completely apples to apples, for the most part, there's some trends that we can tell from the scores we're getting at the package power that we're looking at. So it seemed pretty accurate. Obviously, take these with a grain of salt. What is accurate is whatever the CPU is reporting, this is the score. And as we go through this, I'll tell you what device I was using, because another variable in all of this is memory configuration. And again, I can only use what the hardware I have in front of me. With mobile CPUs, you really don't have the choice of what speed memory you're throwing at things. So I'll kind of point that out as we go through the numbers. So yeah, hopefully that's very clear. Let's get over to the graphs. So let's first look at Intel. And the first one I want to point out is the 1235U. And this is what you would find on the Surface Pro 9. And if we're looking specifically at that one, now that I've kind of highlighted it there, you can see at 8 watts, our package power score on Geekbench 6 multi. So this is your multi-core score, which does scale quite a bit in multi. When you look at single core Geekbench, it kind of will cap out and then you're done, no matter how many more watts you throw at it for the most part. But anyways, Surface Pro 10 is this line here. And you can see here it is at 8 watts, 10 watts, 15 watts, 20 watts, 25, 35, 30 and 35, sorry, and all the way up to 40. I couldn't do much more than that because these are mobile CPUs. That's about as high as it would go. And for the most part, you'll see, especially on AMD end, they're so efficient at this lower range that you can give it a lot more power and kind of spin your wheels and not really go anywhere very far. So yeah, so this right here is the Surface Pro 9. And I want to point out a couple things. Again, this is a U series CPU, 1235U, and it has, not as many cores as something like this one, which is the 13700H that you find on the Surface Laptop Studio 2. It has a way more cores, and what you see with that is it ends up scaling more. So while at low wattages, like that 13700H is actually the worst performing CPU in this benchmark at 8 watts, but it goes up and it scales really well. It scales higher and higher and higher. That said, you will see a trend. All of these blue lines here are Intel, and you'll see that at 15 watts, the 13700H has horrible scores. The 1235 a little bit better, and the 165U actually does quite a bit better, which is good to see. And but all of these blue Intel lines, it's not a very efficient thing. You really have to give it a lot of power, 40 watts, 45 watts, before it even gets close to AMD's offerings at the 7940HS and the HX370, which we'll get into a little bit more. So this is why when people over the last few generations have talked about, how, Intel's better. Well, yeah, once you throw 45 watts at the CPU, you actually see something like a 13700H, and a 14700 would be on this line too. I don't have the data on that because I haven't owned one. But you can see eventually at some point at around 40 watts, and I saw this as well when I did some emulation testing. At some point, the Intel 40 watts plus, yeah, you're getting better performance than what you were getting on the 7940HS, and the orange line's the Z1 Extreme. So yeah, I'll get into those a little bit more. So yeah, let's talk about the Z1 Extreme. One of the cool things about the Z1 Extreme, if you had something like a Legion Go or a ROG Ally, is people didn't realize, like, you have this little, like, $400 like gaming device. It's actually a really decent chip, and I think people didn't realize this. If it ran Windows and you like hooked it up as a Windows machine and you hooked it up to a separate monitor and had a keyboard, it's very powerful. Like, those were the Z1 Extreme, and this is the Legion Go. Just so you know its memory configuration. This orange line here in efficiency is just way better than anything Intel has to offer, again, in the multi-score. So while we're still talking about Intel, as I get sidetracked on the Legion Go and Z1 Extreme, let's switch over to the single core to just kind of compare. And we see kind of the same thing here, where at 8 watts, the 13700H is just complete garbage. Like, it's just a ridiculously poor score. Once you give it about 10 watts, it starts to come to life a little bit. So where you see these U series, like at low wattage, basically, they do a little bit better. But again, that 13700H does wake up quite a bit once you give that single core more than 20 watts. So at 20 watts, that 13700H really comes to life and kind of starts beating on the single core side of things. It starts beating the Z1 Extreme, it starts beating the 7940HS. And overall, once you hit kind of the limit of how much power you can throw at those cores, it ends up being a more powerful processor than the 7940HS or the Z1 Extreme, but you do have to feed it a bit of power. The 165U in the Surface Pro 10 for business, I was actually surprised how much better it was than the 1235U, because it didn't seem like it was going to be that much better, but it actually was when you comparing it in this test. I mean, it was almost on par with the Z1 Extreme in the single core test, but again, it really did not compare in the multi-core tests. Like, those AMD chips do so much with so little at the low end So yeah, but let's keep going. Let's take a look at our AMD side of things, which I already spoke a little bit about, the Z1 Extreme. And I wanted to see how close it was to a 7940HS. And you can see, here's our 7940HS is the red line. And you might be asking, why do you have two red lines here? Okay, well, I did additional testing. And again, this was a lot of testing, guys. This was like test after test after test, changing the configuration at different wattage levels. So even though this looks like one curve, this one curve represents dozens of tests at different watts to get this data. So anyways, the dotted line is an undervolt data point. So I wanted to know how efficient could the 7940HS be if you undervolted it using some specific tools to do that. So you can see if you do undervolt it, and I was able to achieve a negative 40 millivolt undervolt, and that actually gave us this dotted red line, which you can see made the 7940HS much more efficient. I mean, not a ton more efficient, but noticeable. So for example, like what does this actually mean? Well, if you have something like the 7940HS, you can see that at stock, if you're using 30 watts at stock, and you take this line and you were getting, 11,324, you would only have to give it basically 25 watts if it was undervolted to get the same performance. And overall, at the very end of things, you could get more performance with that undervolted curve here. So what that did was, and you could do this on the Z1 Extreme as well, I just didn't have the time to do it, but yeah. So anyways, comparing the Z1 Extreme to the 7940HS, you can see it's actually, this makes sense. The Z1 Extreme is geared towards like small handheld devices, right? So of course it's going to be more efficient at those low wattage levels, but you can see that the 7940HS wakes up a little bit. But this was really close. I think this could just be rate of error, because this line is very close on the Z1 Extreme to the 7940HS. They're very similar configured chips. Could be the same one for all I know. But anyways, but what surprised me is I was looking at the 7940HS and the red line. This is an X13 device, the Asus ROG Flow X13, and you can see, just how good it is at these lower wattages versus Intel, which means you get better performance without needing bigger heat sinks, heavier machines. You can have a slim machine that gives a lot of power at these lower ranges. So anyways, but I was really surprised to see how good the Ryzen AI HX 370 was over even the 7940. The 7940 was already pretty efficient, but that HX 370, my goodness, look at how good the performance is, giving much less power. And this is actually very cool, because if you look at the green line on the HX 370, at 15 watts, you're getting 10,369, and it would actually take, it would take 30 watts on the 7940HS to get the same performance that you're getting at 15 watts. Actually, sorry, I misspoke. It took basically 8 to 10 watts difference. I was looking at that a little wrong. But just look at the curve. You can see not only look at 30 watts. You're getting a 14,186 versus an 11,455. So not only at the 30 watt level are you getting a ton more performance, but you could get the same level at 30 watts on the 7940HX, you could get only using 17, 18 watts to get the same performance. So 30 watts versus 17 watts. That HX 370 is super power efficient and high performing. It's a great chip. And you may have noticed this little dot here, which is our outlier. The reason I only have one data point for the Snapdragon X Elite is I could only verify one wattage level with that because there's no tool that I know of to actually manipulate the Snapdragon's power profiles. So I had to trust it at its 28 watt level and give that power point consumption. So Snapdragon X Elite ends up being the most powerful in the multi-core test, in this test, but I really don't know what its curve looks like. I would guess that its curve would actually be pretty powerful and maybe would drop off here, but it's completely unknown because I can't force it to use a certain amount of watts. So I don't have the power curve in this format for that, but I did want to drop the Snapdragon X Elite to show how good it is. Yes, you're giving up x86 compatibility. That's its Achilles heel. But let's switch back over to single again and take a look at the single core performance figures. And you can see Intel at 810 watts just really not doing well. However, 7940 versus the HX 370. Wow, the HX 370, super power efficient, getting great scores. In fact, it's almost, if you undervolt it, which I did on the HX as well, undervolting this thing gives it, I mean, look at this 10 watt performance. Not only do you have a huge gap at the 10 watt performance, but the 10 watt performance is better than any of these other chips for a single core. So that's that's really cool. And one of the things I noticed, this is the HX 370 on the PX13, the creator laptop from Asus. And one thing I wasn't noticing when I first reviewed that, because I do game reviews, but I don't specifically kind of dial in how much power the CPU is using versus the performance you're getting out of it too much, because the GPU ends up being way more important. But one of the things that I noticed as I spent more time with it is how good a performance I was getting, and it was not heating up hardly at all compared to something like the X13 when doing, basic tasks. And some of that is this, you're using a couple cores at 10 watts, it's really pounding through it at a low wattage level, where to get the same thing, it would need, 20, 25 watts, not doing nearly as much work. Because this is single core performance, but when you multiply that on the multi side, like you're doing, even your web browser doing a couple things, if it can flip through it really quickly at a lower wattage level, you end up getting way better battery life. You end up getting way better performance in general and less heat overall. And because that's the kicker, right? And that's what everyone is worried about: is it getting too hot? Am I not getting enough battery life? So I'm coming to realize that's way more important for people than it is for me in general, because me personally, I'm usually around outlets, but from what, the feedback I get on my videos and what I see people talking about, that's a huge concern for a lot of people, the battery life of things. Me, if I am out and about, I just grab a big power bank and I'm good, but it really does help when you have a device that gets all day battery life. So I was super impressed with that HX 370 multi, and undervolting tended to, it gave about the same performance bump, the undervolt versus the 7940 when it was undervolted. But it really gives you really great performance. So yeah, I think that's the notable things on here. And probably one of the other things that I ought to mention that are absent from these charts are Lunar Lake. And part of that is I just haven't had a Lunar Lake device. I've wanted to get one in, but that's on me. I need to get one in, but I didn't have that for testing. So it would be really interesting to see how Lunar Lake compares on this chart, because if you look at, but Lunar Lake is only so many cores. It's an entry level type thing. They're not really selling Lunar Lake with anything with a discrete GPU. It doesn't even have PCIe lanes that you could actually put a discrete GPU on it. You could still do it over Thunderbolt, and I do want to test that, but I just haven't had Lunar Lake in to do that. But comparing it against something like the 13700H, you can really see where on mobile chips, like even if in a benchmark, if Intel throws 80 watts at it, sure, it's probably going to beat out the AMD in score at some point, but it's not going to beat out that new HX 370, and that's where Intel's in big trouble, because Lunar Lake only has so many cores. Lunar Lake, we already know its multi-core is weak. I would expect Lunar Lake to be very good in this band. You might see it even, mirror the HX 370, but then you'd see it level off and kind of come across about this level, I would guess. We know its multi-score is not great compared to its single score. Because I think if we go down to the single, I know the Lunar Lake single score is pretty high, probably pretty close to the HX 370. It could even be exceeding the HX 370, around that 3000 range, close to the 3000 range. So single core Lunar Lake would be pretty good, pretty effective. But when you want that sustained higher performance, we do know Lunar Lake kind of levels off early. So it'll be interesting to see what we get next gen from Intel, and I hope that you found this deep dive into CPU performance at different wattage levels useful and kind of fun to look at, because I kind of got a little bit obsessed with this, doing this chart, and I've been working on it for a couple weeks now, doing all the benches. It's hard to get all the machines together to actually do this, especially when I'm not people don't send me these machines. I have to source them myself. So anyways, if you are a manufacturer and want to send me stuff to review, I would love to hear from you. But other than that, thanks for watching. Hope you found this useful. I'll stop rambling and I'll let you get on to your next videos. You should check out my channel though. Lots of interesting and unique information. And we'll see you on some future videos.